So my name is Nick Mason. I'm the CEO of Zaka. So Zaka is really set up to solve the digital trust problem in sub-Saharan Africa. We know that by the year 2022, around 60% of the global economy will be digitized. And if you assume, or actually what we know is that by the same year, roughly a similar proportion of people in sub-Saharan Africa will not be digitally identified. So in other words, as the digital economy advances, it leaves behind the same group of people that has always been left behind through service provision. So the inequalities that we experience today will only be exacerbated as the digital economy advances, unless there is a solution for digital trust.
And that solution is?
Zaka. No, really it's Zaka in conjunction with a bunch of other companies and governments, and it's very much a collaborative environment. Just as no single entity, no single person can solve any big problem. That takes multiple parties acting together. Zaka sits at the intersection between what is a citizen's identity, their formal identity, the national identity, and their ability to engage with consumer services, let's say financial services or utility services. We provide the economic identity that links the consumer with the business.
Okay, and sub-Saharan Africa, was there a particular reason why you chose that region?
So personally, it's a region I've always been very interested in. When I was naive and younger, I started an organisation based in Sierra Leone, and ran that for 7 years alongside my work in London. And my interest and passion for the the culture, the economics, the society, the politics, everything from sub-Saharan Africa is maturing with time. The reason that's a personal reason, I will always be focused on that region for my work. But the reason for taking Zaka there is the sheer scale of the problem, and therefore the opportunity that presents itself in digital identity.
And it's almost like you're kind of preparing for what is to come, right? In terms of, because you said the 2022 number,
yeah,
it's quite a worrying one, right? And
it's very nearby as well.
Unfortunately, it is. Time's going really quickly. But still, you want to be prepared, right? You want to try to avoid it. The quicker you can tackle this issue, the better off they are in the future.
Yeah.
How have governments responded to this when you approach them with the proposition?
That's a very good question. Digital identity as a theme is becoming very popular with countries, governments in emerging markets. India, over the last 6 years, has implemented the Aadhaar scheme, which has been enormously successful. I think something like 600 million people during that time frame have been onboarded to the National Digital Identity Scheme, which is an extraordinary success, and it's attracted a great deal of interest from African governments as well. The interest is certainly there. So what happens off the back of digital identity is consumer empowerment, is a growth in the share of the formal economy as opposed to the informal economy, which results in improved tax collection, which results in the government's ability to tie up the social contract more efficiently and to create a stronger bond between the state and the citizen. The governments that we're talking to know, broadly speaking, that digital identity is that enabler. It's not a panacea though, and many of these governments will also be saying there is a foundational element to address first. That is the national ID registry, that's the citizen identity. You have a passport, for example. Many people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have a passport. They're not recorded by the state as being a recognised, authorised citizen of that state.
And you're using technology to obviously solve this. Technology is at the heart of this.
Technology and existing social infrastructure, I think, is really important. So like authenticating an individual in a digital environment, that technology exists. There's some really, really good technology on Fido, Yoti, like the companies out there doing fantastic work. We saw Passport speaking down here today. Is a form of it. It's KYC what they're doing, but similar kind of stuff. We want to leverage that existing technology and bind it to the social structures that are in place in places like Rwanda, where we're starting our operations, so that we can create a distribution model that reaches far more people in a far shorter time frame. The reason being that distribution models in that part of the world are typically very expensive and cumbersome to set up.
Okay, so the story is clear. Can you tell us about the product? What does that actually look like?
Okay, so our distribution model, I mentioned existing social structures. Our distribution model is the health system in Rwanda. So you walk into a health clinic in rural Rwanda, you are given the opportunity to check in for your health appointment by using an Android application. Whilst you fill in the form for that Android application, you're also creating the first kind of layer of your digital identity record. And the really important step there is that we work with the health workers to authenticate, and the insurance companies that are there, to authenticate who an individual is, and therefore verify them in the digital space as well as that analog space that they're receiving treatment in.
Okay, so a person, as you say, will walk into a clinic or a health centre of some sort, along with a team and the staff there that authenticate that digitally and in person.
Yeah.
What happens next?
So then we are able to introduce that customer as a new, trusted and qualified individual that a digital service provider can work with.
Okay, who has access to that information? Is this sort of like privately held with Zaka, or does the government acknowledge it as you know, a proof of identity?
It's considered to be, all fits probably into the KYC, the Know Your Customer spectrum. So it's a functional identity with a degree of proofing required by the government, but the consumer owns their identity. And that's really important. This is where we'll see a shift between what we have here, which is a siloed identity, functional identity system. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of these companies have our data siloed, used specifically for their purposes. What Zaka is saying is, consumer, here is your economic identity. Transact with any number of the services on the Zaka platform and let that identity mature as you transact and as you engage more and more with different services. That makes you more, that record, that history of who you are as a consumer makes you easier to trust, easier to provide services to, easier to market to. Therefore, your experience of services improves. The prices that you're getting, let's say from loan products, improves. And our endeavor is also to see greater efficiency and productivity from our business partners, who are able to access that broader customer base for a far lower price.
Yeah, and it's a critical part of any economy, any country. You know, if people are able, if small to medium-sized businesses, kind of business entrepreneurs can actually access loans, access financing offers, and they can create these businesses, and those businesses create jobs. Yeah. And it actually helps the country in a much better way than, say, typical philanthropy, where you just say donating food and shelter to them. What's your angle on this?
I mean, so my background is in the social sector. I started work for, I built an education charity in Sierra Leone, as I said, and the very kind of material, the very material concerns of people in the slums in Freetown that we were working with were access to education, access to finance, access to healthcare, access to sanitation services, whatever it might be. So specifically in the context of identity, as the digital economy advances, that introduces new cost structures, which inevitably will price out a certain portion of the analog service provision. So as those are priced out, the digital economy's responsibility to people expands very quickly. Unless people, consumers, have the ability to access that digital economy, then the economy is failing people. And this, you know, we see essentially the economy acting to the detriment of people that it intends originally to serve. So, you know, what I would like to see is a very kind of as a case in point for what I would like to see, let's say in 15 years resulting from Zaka, is that a rural consumer has been able to access a growing maturity of services that have enabled them to ultimately build a company and employ loads of people off the back of simply being able to be trusted in a digital context.
Right, because trust is obviously the key word here, right? It's like how can you...
Yeah, I mean, every market works off trust, and the digital economy is no different. Without any of us really even realizing, digital identity is probably the single biggest driver of our engagement online.
Will this replace passports? So, where's the vision for this? Where will Zaka kind of take this in, say, 5 years' time?
So we won't replace passports. I think an important breakdown in the identity space is you have a foundational identity and a functional identity. Foundational ID is provided by governments, and functional is generally provided by the private sector. Where I see Zaka going is being the single biggest digital identity and service aggregation platform in sub-Saharan Africa. What that means in practice is a complete transformation of how rural people especially are able to engage with services that can fundamentally change their lives. More access to credit, more access to education, more access to healthcare, more access to utilities. And that is happening not just within borders, but across borders. One of the big problems facing sub-Saharan African economies is that around 16% of trade in Africa is between African countries, which is very, very low when you consider that 16, when you consider that over 70% of trade in Europe is between European countries. So if economic identity can play a role in facilitating broader trust in the market, more access to consumer services across borders, freer movement of economic assets across borders, then that would be an extraordinary thing, not just for individuals, but on the macro scale.
So that's really interesting. Can you elaborate more on that?
It's a very complicated space that I'm not really, fully equipped to answer in detail.
Fine. It's just the concept of saying this is going to facilitate more trade internally with African countries to other African countries, right?
Yeah.
And you've used the Europe example, so
Yeah.
look at Europe, look at the numbers there. This is kind of like a metric that might be easy to miss. So this is what I find fascinating.
Okay,
about this, right?
yeah. So let's take an example. Many of the micro traders, the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises that are in Uganda and Rwanda trade across the Rwandan-Ugandan border. And doing that requires certain risks for those entrepreneurs to take. Firstly, they're often carrying their product or their cash on them. They've either got their product or they've got the cash, having hopefully successfully sold the product. Risks involved in that would be the sorts of risks that most entrepreneurs would never be willing to take. The risk of seizure of products, the risk of excessive fines, the risk of theft. Not that this is a particularly dangerous border, but those risks exist. With those individuals being able to access a broader range of existing digital services, these services exist, then they might be able to better protect themselves against the risk of excessive fines, of excessive duties, of loss of cash, basically in that process, because they can access a cross-border banking service. Ecobank has services now in 34 different African countries. They've got a really good solution for moving cash across borders, but you have to be an Ecobank customer to access that. And what we'd like to see is our service being able to introduce Ecobank to a far greater number of people who can then, for example, move their products across borders more safely.
Wow.
Or rather move their revenues across borders more safely.
What is it like being in this space? I mean, like I said, when I first came across Zaka, I just loved the idea of how this impacts the lives of hundreds, thousands of people, if not millions of people around the world, right? And particularly people that need the help the most, people that are unfortunately so far from the rest of kind of the developed nations, right? They're living an entirely different life. They're missing out on so much. What is it like on a day-to-day basis to be working so close to those people?
So, I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that always strikes people about sub-Saharan Africa who haven't spent much time there is the pace of development. And things are moving forward astonishingly quickly. The lifestyles of urban people really don't differ that much from the lifestyles of people here. So there's a segment of the people that we interact with who are well off, highly educated, people who would be just as comfortable navigating London as they would be Kigali. there's a segment which is the segment you're talking about, which is the rural audience, who are by and large fit into that lower middle income category. My view on servicing this audience with a commercial product is that we have a massive responsibility. And that's partly why I'm so passionate about making Zakka work. A handful of companies in Africa will succeed in getting a significant market share when it comes to digital identity and the provision of those identity services. It's very important to me that Zakka does it, because this company is being set up, grounded in ethics, grounded in the commitment to serve people who come from low middle income backgrounds. We're feature phone first, which is the most basic form of mobile phone. We have inclusivity bedded into our values. And I think partly for fear of the risk of this market being won by, less people whose ethics I can't necessarily guarantee. That's why I feel very passionate about leading Zakka in the right direction.
It's an admirable cause, Nick. I love what you're doing. I wish you the best of luck.
Cool.
It was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much.
Thanks.